Looking for psi in all the wrong places.
We starting? Yep. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so just some quick definitions. Psi is an umbrella term that covers telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. Parapsychology is the scientific study of psi, and also topics relating to postmortem survival. Today I'm only going to talk about psi and not survival. So over the years, parapsychologists have been rallying around standardized protocols to test various aspects of psi. And that's a good thing. Standardization is helpful. You can do meta-analysis on your data. You can replicate in different labs. Typically, a typical experiment would work is we'd recruit people from a general population, and we would run them through a psi protocol. But when we do this, what we find is that not everyone's data actually produces evidence for psi. So being scientists, we're very clever, and we have figured out ways that we might be able to optimize our populations to find high performers. And so some of those ways, short of full genetic testing and fMRIs, might include things like belief, whether or not people meditate, levels of creativity, previous psi experience, and so on. In addition, we've become good at looking at target optimization and the roles of researchers in their experiments. So even when we optimize for all these things, we still end up with a portion of our selected optimized population whose data don't necessarily support evidence for psi. I find this very annoying. And this is the thing I've been sort of obsessing out over. So we end up with these two populations. Our optimized subset of our optimized population that doesn't do well on a test, and then this whole other group of people that for some reason don't do well on these tests at all. And so I'm really interested in understanding why that is. So in this talk, I'm going to give some examples of where I'm seeing this sort of play out in my own research, and a new research project that we hope will sort of look into this a little bit more. So the first example I want to give is a joint research project between Julia Mossbridge and the Mossbridge Institute and the Windbridge Institute, where I work, and that's not confusing at all. But anyway, and so we haven't formally published these data yet, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But there's one aspect of this experiment that I wanted to talk about, which is relevant. So at the beginning of our experiment, after we selected our population, we asked all of our participants to fill out a survey and rate their frequency of precognitive experiences. So on one end, we're like, no, I've never had a precognitive experience. On the other end, they often have precognitive experiences. So this is the results of that survey, with basically 29% of the people in our population were frequent precoggers. And I'm like, those are our peeps. That's going to be good. But when we run the experiment and look at the results of the data, what we find that of these frequent precoggers, only 39% showed a result, and 61% failed. Sorry, that's wrong. Our test wasn't designed in a way that allowed us to capture what these people were experiencing. So to some extent, as a general test, this didn't quite cut it, but we were testing for something very specific. In another set of experiments I've been working on for a while, I've been using real-time 3D virtual reality systems to develop psi testing and training applications. And these have run across a number of different scenarios, mostly dealing with first responders and search and rescue applications. We've also been doing things with threat avoidance and asset recovery. I can't talk about all this stuff today, but I'm going to focus on the threat avoidance piece. So this is a pretty straightforward simulation. You have an operator. The goal is to move the operator safely from point A to point B in the simulation. The operator has to make intuitive choices about which way to go, so they avoid roadside bombs, basically. And so in the first round of experiments, we used these operators, and they were relying on their own intuitive abilities to safely navigate the space. And what we found is that this worked spectacularly poorly. And what we found is that the operators were incredibly good at finding these bombs. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense, because the people that would be attracted to being involved in this kind of experiment, they're a little bit adrenaline junkies. And so the way the experiment works is if you successfully get to the end, nothing happens. You get a pat on the head and you're rewarded for your ability to not get hurt. But what makes more sense is the reason why these people were finding these explosives is that when you bump into one, there's an adrenaline rush, it's a surprise, you get a visceral hit. And so it really appealed to the people that were actually doing the experiment. So I had to take a step back and rethink this, because unlike Dean, I don't have a lot of research assistants, so I'm involved in all of our experiments. So for the second round, I decided maybe we could pair the operators in the experiment with intuitives. And so the intuitives would be at a remote location, watching the operators remotely, and then giving feedback to the operators about how to navigate the space. And this actually worked much better. Our success rates were getting higher, but the intuitives didn't like this at all. They were really uncomfortable with the real-time video aspect, and the whole guns and bombs thing really wasn't sitting comfortably with this population. And I said, well, that's a really interesting challenge. How do we incorporate the talents of intuitives in a way that works for them on an emotional and psychological level, but still meet the objectives of our test, which is to safely navigate our operators across the space in real time? So I became really interested in this idea of proxy tasking. And so I ended up developing a second app specifically for the intuitives. And so instead of the intuitive seeing our friend with an M4, they got to see this dog. And instead of navigating this post-apocalyptic landscape, they got to see this little island with a forest on it. And so again, in the third round of experiments, we had our operator and our intuitives, and the intuitives were navigating the dog through the island space, and the operators were in the simulation, and there was a real-time feedback loop between the two. And the results from this, while still very preliminary, are these are the best results so far. We seem to be getting much higher accuracy rates. The intuitives seem much happier, and of course, the operators have sort of stopped blowing themselves up on purpose. Okay, so the interesting bit, from my perspective, is that we basically had this simulation which had we had the simulation of the threat avoidance simulation, and we had these two very different populations that were interacting with that simulation and having different results and different feelings about it. And it wasn't until we basically tweaked the facade of that application that we suddenly got really good responses and data and evidence for psi out of this other intuitive population. So that drew me back to this annoying thing. And I started to think, well, could we, instead of using these standardized protocols, could we give each participant their own highly individualized task optimized for a psi modality, motivation, and other personality variables? And so we're starting to see this move away from certain kinds of standardization in other fields. So in education, for example, the SATs were recently tweaked to account for people's socioeconomic factors that might impact their scores. And also in education, the GREs were recently dumped from a bunch of universities as requirements for admission, because initially they weren't really good predictors of how people would do in grad school. And then in healthcare, we're seeing sort of this interest in a move away from standards of care to highly specialized treatments based on genetics and other factors. So what would it mean? Could we take this idea of high specialization and apply it to psi research? And if we were to do that, would we be able to capture evidence for psi in new populations, create opportunities for personal psi exploration, provide new tools for application development? So I came up with this project with the not so exciting name of the Psi Task Optimization Project. And it's very simple. We recruit a bunch of participants. At the moment, we're giving everyone the BFI-10, the Machiavellian scale, and the the empathy quotient. And I'm doing this specifically at this time because I really want to leverage off of what we learned from our intuitives and operators in the other experiment, in the threat avoidance experiment. Once we have our participants, we'll break them, randomly assign them to two groups. We'll let them play a series of games. These games are optimized to appeal to people with these certain personality, I don't want to use the word traits, but I'm going to use the word traits, in a counterbalanced fashion, and then we'll analyze the data. So what are these games that we're talking about? So we're going to continue to work on things like virtual reality and augmented reality games, apps, and other online activities that people can do. But I have to admit, I'm a little apped out. There's this really, and it makes sense to use apps. You can get a lot of, or online experiments, you can get a lot of people through. You can, you get accuracy of protocol and all those kinds of things. But I start to feel like we're moving away from the human components that, for me, is what psi is really all about. It's this human interaction piece that I feel is really missing. So I started developing, literally in the last like 3 or 4 weeks, a series of board games that allow groups of people to come together and try to experience their own psi. And I think this is really interesting because when you get people together, they're in their own, you're in biofields that you're sharing, there's the opportunity for spontaneous psi to express itself and things like that. So these games, which I actually brought, if anybody's interested, we can talk about it later, are a series of flexible, and they're still in the design phases. We literally just did this over the last few weeks. They're a series of flexible components that allow us to test different game mechanics and play styles. So we can tweak things like the timing, whether it's a single player activity, multiplayer, competitive, so on. And then we can also tweak the activities to whether it's a general ESP test or a telepathy test, precog, PK, et cetera. Although I try not to get too hung up on those separations in modality. So I do have some very, very preliminary findings from people using these games as they're still in the design phase. So the first thing we sort of learned is that people with lower empathy scores tend to do better on competitive games that are precog based, and they tend to be really good at macro PK tests, specifically dice rolling. On the flip side of that, we found that people with higher empathy scores do better in collaborative games, co-op games, but they tend to do really poorly on the macro PK tests. And then we had a third, one of the other games we started to play with was this game that I kind of love, but it's called Psychic Spy. And your goal is to prevent your opponent from guessing your secrets. And it's sort of a telepathy-based game, and unfortunately, no one has done well on this game. It's all been coming in a chance, and I got to figure out why that's happening. Again, as I said, all this stuff has sort of been happening over the last few weeks, and sort of what I realized a little bit late in the game was that essentially what we're doing at the end of the day is we're taking tests and we're gamifying them. So it probably would be a really good idea, in addition to our standard psychological measures, to have a good idea of how people interact with games, what they like about games, what they don't like about games, so on and so forth. And so there's some online measures that let us create gamer motivation profiles. So I think in addition, we're going to start looking at these data. These are just 3 examples from 3 different participants. I'm over on the far, my right, And these are some volunteers that let me look at their data. And there's similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. So building, taking these variables into account as we develop new games and as we look at the data, it was probably going to be pretty helpful. So speaking of data, so the final bit is about data. How are we going to think about analyzing these data? And as we collect more data, the relationships between all these different variables, maybe not just whole readings or whole survey scores, but maybe item by item scores, these relationships may end up being kind of complex. This may provide an opportunity to apply machine learning to create predictive models, allowing us to better determine which tasks are better for which people. And ultimately, this may produce more robust experimental results and allow us to develop more highly customized applications, which allow people to better utilize psi in their daily lives. So just some quick acknowledgements. First of all, thank you to everyone who's been supporting the Wimbridge Institute for the past 11 years. It's amazing to me I get up every morning and do this work. I'm humbled and proud of that. Of course, Dr. Julie Beischel, my wife, our volunteers, Ryan, Michael, and Katie, Julia Mossbridge for continued enthusiasm around various aspects of my research and being just a generally great collaborator. Of course, the SSC Program Committee for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. And just another quick note to all the people working behind the scenes at this conference as an attendee and a speaker. This has been really smooth. I know that there's a ton of work that goes into this. So with that, I will attempt to answer questions. Thank you.
So I have two comments.
Sure.
One is about a demographic that you might not be aware of. There is evidence that there is a genetic variation in humans and at least 40 other species called a highly sensitive trait, which is actually known to encompass a number of different brain traits now since its original discovery. I'm one of the people who has this trait. So that's like 1 in 5 people in this room. And so I would think that there's going to be an overlap between highly sensitive people and intuitives and people who don't want to run through a simulator and get vertigo and be in bombs. I would definitely be in that category. But I think that they may not be fully overlapping. And so having some sort of testing for that might be useful as a demographic to understand what they need in games.
Absolutely. My general goal is to make psi experiences available to as many people as possible. So I try to stay away from things that include, full genetic testing or fMRIs or things like that. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. There's far more subtlety in people's variations than what I'm specifically trying to capture here. But we need to start somewhere, and I already have some data around certain populations, and I just wanted to continue to build off that. But that's a good point.
My second quick comment is that playing games is a different motivation than real life. I've been able to create extreme things to happen in real life, like causing a U-Haul truck that had run out of gas carrying several tons to go for about 5 extra miles to get to the gas station when it was definitely empty, and it literally stalled the moment we pulled in. But I'm not going to be able to pull that off in a game. There's just not that motivation. So it might be useful to consider the difference in motivation.
You're absolutely correct, and as a highly sensitive person, you know that you have that ability. What I'm trying to do is sort of use this as a gateway drug to give people some confidence that they can experience psi on their own. Because I run into a lot of people that are like, I'm a psychic brick, I can't do this stuff. Guess what? With the right set and setting and some encouragement from people around you, you may actually produce data that's psi conducive. But thank you.
Mark, my question is actually similar to hers. Did you take age and sex into account? I didn't see where maybe you'd done that or not. My son would love Mortal Kombat. Me, you'd lose me at Mario Brothers.
Right, but we also have, so for example, one of the simulations we're working with is a financial investment one. That might be more appealing to you? Or a research, I don't.
Hey.
So again, it's all about understanding people's specific motivations. I was dealing with the specific motivations of the population I had in hand, but the broader spectrum of this is to really dig into the things that are exciting about people and customize experiences for them.
Right.
Okay, 47 quick comments for you.
You need to speak
Actu-
up a little bit.
what's-
Sorry.
No, I was joking. One, really cool. Thank you for presenting this.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Two, I particularly like the message that you're sending, and that it's not all about some kind of pre-established categories. It's going to be very easy for people to sort of decide, well, I can't do this because I don't have this particular gene or I don't have whatever, and not recognize that that may be a small piece in a much larger puzzle that really dictates this. So again, kudos. I really love the message. And then the third, which was actually the reason I got up here, was just a quick observation that the one game that had no results was founded on greed.
No, it's absolutely true. But greed is actually a powerful motivator for some people,
Yes.
and maybe just not for my particular population. But
There are a lot of powerful motivators, and it may be that greed is one that deliberately might hinder some of these things in comparison to others. So.
that's a really good point. Thank you very much. Hi, York.
Hello, I'm glad I already have your contact information because I love what you're doing with the games, and you can expect some communications from me in the near future.
Thank you.
But for right now, I just wanted to note, given the emphasis or given the apparent effect of empathy and collaborative personality on psi hit versus psi miss, I was a little bit surprised that there seemed to be a recent genre of games that was missing, as far as I could tell, from the stuff you'd been working on, which is fully collaborative games, cooperative games, where all of the players have to work together to beat a challenging board, and they either all lose or all win.
We do have a model that does that. Clearly, I couldn't talk about. There are literally 14 different variations of these games currently, and I was only able to show a few. But yes, fully collaborative against the game is one of the models we're looking at. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mark. How's it going? You did great. That was awesome. Two things. One, thanks for saying kind things about me, but also I want to say some kind things about you publicly, which are the Windbridge Institute, as far as I can tell, is the most creative and productive organization doing this kind of work. It's amazing. So thank you for that. Two, I just want to support you in this, looking at this PK precog negative correlation, because I'm finding that too, and I think that's really interesting, and it speaks to sort of a psi-sensory, psi-motor sort of skill set that seems to be mutually, balanced.
Thank you, Julia. Hello.
Right, thank you. Over the years, I worked with a lot of people, some that have reasonable talent at the start and others that don't. And in informal protocol, I found that if those that have good talent just simply sit back and focus on the intention of the one that's not a good performer to do well on the next round, and just wish or hope or intend that person to do well, he or she will. So it's like a transfer, temporarily maybe, of a side talent. And in some instances, it's actually lingered more than just simply for that experimental period. I wonder if you've had that kind of experience.
I think that's fascinating, actually. No, I haven't really thought about that, but it makes total sense. Have you published this?
Unfortunately, no, but I have written about it here and there in pieces.
Okay, that's a fascinating idea. Thank you so much for
Okay,
sharing.
thank you. I can get back with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.